Hello my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. Yes, my friends, I know it has been a while. Due to travel and everything that's been happening in the world, this means that I've had to primarily focus on my geopolitics video for the History of Everything podcast page. But we are going to do many more alternate history videos, and if you want your suggestion to be in the next alternate history video that we do, make sure to go ahead and put your comment and suggestion down in the comment section below, and the top 5 most liked are going to get put into a poll, just like what you can see on the screen here. That in turn will be voted upon and will determine the next thing that we are going to do. In this case though, the one by an overwhelming margin that you all chose from last time is, what if Hitler was overthrown in 1940 to 1942? Which, okay, the specific time constraints in this apply a lot of pressure and make it so that very specific things have to happen. Let's dive into it. Considering that we're talking about a coup or assassination or something taking place in 1940 to 1942, that means that starting things off in 1936, there's just really no point. Nothing really is going to happen prior to this that could potentially then lead to a coup succeeding in 1940. Thus, we'll be beginning on the 14th of August 1939 as war breaks out across Europe. Naturally, of course, we'll be playing as the German Reich, and with historical AI on, we're going to go ahead and dive into this. The problem, as I've said so many times when talking about alternate history scenarios, is that in order for a scenario to happen, certain things have to happen prior to make that a reality. It's not enough that simply one can ask, oh, what if Hitler was assassinated? Oh, what if this happened? You'd have to have specific events take place prior in order to make that happen in the first place. Luckily, for this scenario, there's actually quite a number of things that could happen. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Europe during this time was not exactly the most stable of places. And even when it came to the rise of the Nazi Party to take power within Germany, there was many points in which this could not have happened, or potentially it still could have happened, but Hitler would have been removed from power, either from some kind of coup effort within the party or an actual assassination attempt, of which there were many different attempts upon his life over the course of really the 1920s all the way moving into when he finally took his own life in 1945. The problem with our scenario though here is that most of the attempts upon Hitler's life would take place prior to war actually breaking out. Bombs that were hidden inside of podiums, shooting attempts on his car, there was a variety of different things that were done. Some of these, in fact, came very close to succeeding, but there was one particular type of thing, one particular political event that if it had taken place would have been massive, and that is what we're going to be using as the base of our scenario, the Oster conspiracy. For those who are not familiar with this particular conspiracy, we have to jump back into 1936 in order to view the map, or rather, I should say, it should be 1938, but we're going to use the 1936 map to represent this, because everything about the Oster conspiracy focuses on Czechoslovakia. Essentially, the position of Hitler within the Nazi Party was not exactly the most secure during this time, and there was a genuine fear among a number of his different political and military commanders that if he led the country to war to, say, attack Czechoslovakia over the Sudetenland, something that in our own timeline was resolved peacefully, that this was something that would lead to a wider war with the Allies, and that was a war that Germany would not be able to win. As such, there was a conspiracy, a major one, to overthrow the government if it is that Hitler tried to wage war upon Czechoslovakia. For anyone who's curious about very specific strategies, if you go and play as Czechoslovakia and you resist and fight against the surrender of the Sudetenland and actually fight against Germany and don't allow them to invade your country, there's a chance that in doing so, you will send the German state into a civil war, which we're not going to be able to do here today, because that's not the scenario that you built. Thank you, person who suggested this and said that no, we can't do this in 1938, it has to be 1940 to 1942. But joke's on you all, the Oster conspiracy did not end there. See, after the annexing of the Sudetenland and subsequently the takeover of Bohemia and turning Slovakia into a puppet state, Germany was seen as triumphant across Europe, and the Allies were seen as weak. Hitler was seen by many within Germany as the greatest statesman to ever exist, which drastically strengthened his position. But there were still some military members who believed that if he actually tried to wage war at this time, that this is something that would lead to the downfall of Germany, and they didn't want that. Weirdly enough, though, that belief didn't exactly apply to Poland. So despite the fact that it was guaranteed by the Allies that waging war against Poland would lead to war with the United Kingdom and France, most German officers specifically wanted a war with Poland in order to reclaim Danzig. So what that means is that war against Poland is still going to happen. War with the Allies is still going to break out, and bada bing bada boom, a lot of death still occurs. The invasion of Poland would take place from September 1st all the way going into October of 1939. In just merely a matter of like 4 or 5 weeks, the entire state would capitulate, it would collapse. With the fall of Warsaw by October 6th, you would have the complete collapse of Poland. And yet, despite the fact that Poland would fall in, again, early October, there wouldn't actually be any furthering of any conflict until heading all the way into April of 1940. This was a period of time in history that is known as, like, the False War. Or rather, I should say that within the French name, the proper term is phony war, a period of time in which France and Britain basically just sat there and did nothing while Poland fell and nothing would happen. The entire time while all this was happening, Hans Oster, the officer that is the mastermind behind the whole thing with the Oster conspiracy, he was continuously feeding information to the Allies, specifically in order to give them updates on when the planned invasion of the West was going to come. But over the course of the phony war, really nothing was going to happen, and just in our new timeline that we are creating here, nothing would be happening either as well. Poland would still end up being partitioned with the Soviets, of course that would still end up happening, but the big crazy part about all this, where it is that our scenario is going to have to start taking place, is really at the end of 1939 here, heading into the beginning of 1940. The issue specifically being that Hans Ulster, the guy that I've mentioned here multiple times already, during the time that he was continuously feeding information to the Allies, the veracity of that information was starting to be questioned quite a bit. The reason being is because every couple days or weeks, he'd be sending an update saying, oh, the invasion is going to happen. Oh, the invasion is going to happen. Oh, hey guys, guess what? The invasion is going to happen. And ultimately, it didn't happen. Initially, there had been plans for an invasion of the West that would start in November. I believe the initial date was like November 12th, I think it was. This is something that, if it had occurred, many officers within the German military did not believe that it was a fight that they would actually be able to win. As such, they became determined that if Hitler went and launched an invasion of the West, that they would in turn coup the government and take things over. The Oster conspiracy would continue. So, the conspirators were continuously feeding information to the Allies about invasion plans in the hopes that the invasion would fail. The problem becomes is that so many delays kept on happening during this time period that the information was seen as faulty. It was seen as, well, not just faulty, false. November got pushed into December, which got pushed into January, which kept on getting pushed further and further and further until eventually an invasion of the West was not set to happen until spring. What this means is that despite the fact that the information was real that the Allies were being presented, they didn't believe it. So the question then really becomes, what is it are we able to actually change in this timeline in order to make our scenario come true? Well, first off, there needs to not be nearly as many false reports that are made to the Allies. Oster sent all this information, which was valuable, yes, but let's say that a number of those information missives never actually made it to the Dutch government. It never actually made it to the Allies. In this scenario, this would have been significantly less false reports of planned invasions and less crying wolf that would have in turn made the United Kingdom and France more likely to believe other information that was set to arrive. The actual timeline of the varying different invasions, these are still going to happen historically just as they did in our timeline. And that, my friends, in turn leads us to the big scenario that creates all of this, the next opportunity, the point in which the conspiracy is most likely to take place, moving here into 1940. Operation Weserübung. Norway is a critical strategic point and would be an obvious point of attack for an enemy wanting to disrupt our steel trade with Sweden. We cannot risk our enemies setting up bases in the region. To obtain a good staging area for the invasion of Norway, we need to move on to Denmark first. Yes. The thing is, back during World War II, in the beginning, Germany had gone and invaded Denmark and then specifically Norway, not because they wanted to take over and get the resources of these necessarily, though the resources of Norway would end up actually being quite valuable. No, the reason that they really wanted to do this is because they wanted to be able to secure trade with Sweden, of which these northern provinces that you can see right here were extremely rich in iron and other sources that were necessary for the German war machine. Trade with Sweden was easily one of the most valuable things that kept the German military going. The takeover of resources in Norway, as well as utilizing their many different ports for the purpose of naval operations, well, that was just pretty much an added bonus. The big thing was security to protect Sweden. The crazy part about all of this, as we're preparing for an invasion right now, is that historically, what happened is that Denmark fell in a matter of 6 hours? That's it. And Norway fell very quickly. But this was an extremely risky maneuver. Information about the invasion was being fed by Hans Ulster to the Allies, and yet somehow the planned invasion of Norway, this information never managed to reach British ears. So the Royal Navy was not prepared to intercept German troops, but the plan was at this time, the way that the Oster conspiracy developed and continued was that after a disastrous failure in Norway, this would in turn weaken Hitler's position, which would allow German military officers to take over the government. Of course, as we know in our own own timeline, that didn't actually happen. This takeover of Denmark as well as Norway was a rapid and massive success. So let's say then, hypothetically, in this new timeline that we have built, there is not nearly as many scenarios in which the information coming out of Germany is seen as, well, boy crying wolf, right? The Allies are more inclined to believe Hans Oster and others, his contact that he specifically had in the Netherlands. I believe it was Major Sass was his name. Denmark in this time would still very easily fall, though perhaps maybe in this time, it's not a matter of 6 hours. Instead, maybe it takes 24 hours, maybe even 2 days, a solid 48 hours, which, although that is not that much time, simultaneously that means that the British Navy is able to get into position, that they get this information, that they actually hear about the planned invasion of Norway and are then prepared to launch a strike against German forces as they prepare their invasion of Norway itself. Denmark does eventually surrender, becoming a puppet, and so it is then that an invasion of Norway is launched. German military forces immediately prepare, but the result of this initial launch is that naval superiority is not able to be achieved, as German forces head out with thousands of troops in order to be able to take out the forces in southern Norway. They are in turn ambushed by the Royal Navy of the British. The few forces that manage to make it out of this ambush reach into southern Norway, but as it turns out, instead of leaving their forts largely abandoned like they had in our timeline, the Norwegian military was in this timeline actually ready. The government was not as weak-willed as it had been, and in turn was able to resist off German advances. This in turn would have been an absolutely crushing defeat, destroying a northern invasion force. It is here that things really would begin to fall into question, as the idea of, okay, well, now we are at war with the West, and that means we have to face off against the Royal Navy. This would be the prime example that the German military commanders would see of, hey, the Royal Navy just utterly eviscerated our northern force. This is not something that we're going to be able to handle. The response by Adolf Hitler would have been to call for an immediate invasion of the West, to launch an attack against both the Netherlands and Belgium, and from there be able to invade into France itself. The planned invasion of the West, which had actually, the original plans for this in our own timeline had fallen right into the lap of the Belgians, who received it after a plane crashed with the plans on it. They didn't believe that these plans were real, so they were not prepared. What we're going to say that happens in our own timeline is that Oster is continuously feeding this information to the West, and that plane crash does not happen, which in turn allows them to believe and actually know where the planned invasion is supposed to come from. The original planned invasion called for a launch through Belgium, and this is precisely what goes down, except this time, the Belgians are actually prepared. Not only that, but the French had moved up some defensive positions in order to be able to help protect the Belgians further. What this means is that the mass German attack to invade Belgium is actually stopped. Thousands of Germans begin to die over the course of this action, and in this, they're not actually able to make the progress that they were in our own timeline. In our own timeline, by June 25th of 1940, the invasion of France was over. The entirety of Western Europe had completely collapsed to the German Reich. But in this new timeline, that doesn't happen, and moving into August, the Germans have still not made any progress. The only means by which they were able to take anything was through Poland. Every single other thing has failed. That makes the military turn against Adolf. If we were doing a proper playthrough of Germany and actually trying to show all of this happening to Czechoslovakia, this is an event that you can actually see in the game, the Oster conspiracy. Believing that Hitler had pushed Germany into a war it cannot win, a group of senior officers within the Wehrmacht have launched a coup. It appears to have been orchestrated by Colonel Hans Oster of the Abwehr, which was the German, basically their MI5, their CIA. It was their military intelligence service. So it appears to have been orchestrated by Colonel Hans Oster of the Abwehr, but Generals Beck, von Brauch, I believe was the name, Halder, and Admiral Canaris have also been confirmed as involved. Heavily armed men lying in wait in several Berlin apartments have converged on the Reichskanzlei, intent on liquidating Hitler and his closest associates. A fierce gun battle is currently raging inside of the building. Now, when we were talking about an alternate history scenario, there is no actual guarantee that any of this works. There is a possibility even in the game when you play this and you are fighting Czechoslovakia, depending upon your war score, there is a 33% chance that the coup succeeds, there is a 33% chance that it fails, there is a 33% chance that, well, I forget what the other one is, but something else happens. I can't exactly remember what it was. Either way, we are going to cheat and say that the conspiracy succeeded. The heavy fighting in the Reichskanzlei has reduced the building to a burning ruin. Despite a large number of SS soldiers rushing to Hitler's aid, army units loyal to the conspirators joined the fray and proved decisive. The Führer has been confirmed as killed, and the conspirators have successfully stormed all the government buildings in Berlin. A large portion of the Wehrmacht have gone over to the other side, but many officers are still National Socialist loyalists. Who will be leading them? This presents us with the opportunity of saying death to National Socialism and having the conspirators go and wage a war to free the state, having Heinrich Himmler take over the National Socialists and him fighting to stay in power, or Hermann Göring. Well, he is a person that potentially would be the guy who takes over the National Socialists, as he was the one who had the most decisive political clout in that time. In this case, though, we will say death to National Socialism. We are going to assume from this that the conspirators succeeded, that a large percentage of the varying different officers under the government previously went and signed up with them in order to be able to free the state, and ironically enough, their primary goal was to bring back the monarchy. What would follow from this, considering that we have France, the United Kingdom, Belgium, all of these varying forces that are now allied as the Allies, you have a civil war that would then launch within Germany. This brings us the event Civil War in Germany. A group of Wehrmacht officers opposed to the current war have launched a coup against Hitler in Berlin. An unidentified party of armed men stormed the Reichskanzlei and successfully liquidated the German Führer after an intense gun battle with his SS bodyguards. The conspirators have managed to take control over most of Berlin, and many Wehrmacht units have gone over to their side. Forces still loyal to the Nazis have rallied under new leadership and vowed to purge Germany of the communist dissidents and foreign agents currently occupying Berlin. The problem becomes in the scenario for the German Reich and the forces under it is that this is the exact opportunity that France, the United Kingdom, and others would desperately want and need. As you can imagine, hundreds of thousands of men would immediately be sent over to specifically help the German conspirators to fight against the Nazis, which have been heavily split. Because look at it like this, my friends. Over the course of 1940, the German military had like 4 to 5 million personnel in it. If you want to imagine that half, or even less than half, let's say a third of those defected over to the conspirators, and the majority of them sided with the Nazis, that still means you're talking about a scenario in which millions of men have now signed up to fight against Germany from within the country, which in turn leads to mass chaos. There is simply no way that they would have the proper organization. And if things turned out the way they did in our own timeline, with military leaders specifically turning against the National Socialists, who at their biggest had really only a popularity of like 30 or 40%, at least prior to their, mass takeover and turn everything into a one-party state, it still means that the majority of people, the higher echelons within the military, would have not actually been pro-Nazi. They would have just worked with the Nazis in order to be able to further their own interests. That means that the majority of people would end up siding against them in an event that something like this took place, and the German Republic, or the early stages of it here, would join the Allies. Weirdly enough, in this timeline right now, Italy has joined the conflict, which doesn't actually make any sense in here. Italy did not really participate during the time period of the phony war. The only reason that they even launched their own invasion into France is specifically because the Germans were making massive gains and they didn't want to potentially miss out on those conquests. So no, Italy would not actually have joined in as they did here, which I'm going to need to fix real quick. Considering the size of German military forces, this is still not something that would inherently be easy. France is something that was very defensive-minded. The UK, though they would have been a little bit more offensive-minded, still would not have had the capabilities on the land side to be able to perform nearly as well as they would later on over the course of the war. What would then follow is likely a series of brutal conflicts and fighting as war would break out quite literally everywhere. Though you can see right here that Hungary and Romania have joined the Axis, as is likely to happen from historical AI. With a war breaking out in the way that it did, the likelihood of that happening is exceptionally low, which is something that we're also going to have to fix in this. The reason that they did so, Romania had signed up, is to specifically defend itself from the aggressions of the Soviets and others. They're not going to want to actually deal with any of this mess, as in this scenario, Germany is no longer the big bad power that is able to actually defend and help their interests. With the death of Hitler, Mussolini sees no actual reason to go and interfere with the Allies. In fact, if anything, Mussolini in this new timeline would actually likely side with the Allies. Over the course of history leading up to the events in World War II, there was many different overtures by the Allies, specifically England, to try and get Italy to join with them in order to check the power of the rising Nazi forces. Mussolini was not exactly friends with Adolf, and even then only saw him as a means by which to further Italian ambitions. There had been plans by Italy to specifically take over regions of Austria, which had been claimed as rightful Italian clay. As such, the idea of the Allies then offering a position to Mussolini to, say, invade from the south, and from there be able to secure that Austrian territory that he wanted, this is something that would probably happen in this new timeline. I just tried to make that happen and the game crashed. It couldn't even handle what it is that I was doing. Okay, going back into it. Seeing the opportunity to make some moves, the Soviet Union would start to make moves upon Romania, which in turn would be forced to give up its territory. The problem is that heading into 1940, the population is going to be extremely split, which is going to make this a brutal civil war, even if the Allies with their new German allies in this circumstance are actually to make grounds. Simultaneously, the amount of efforts that are going to be made to specifically weaken and destroy as much as possible before it is that they're able to take over is going to exact a heavy toll upon the populace. The Nazis grow ever more fanatical and desperate as we advance, often fighting until the surrounding areas lie in ruins. There have been reports of scorched earth tactics in accordance with Hitler's Neubefehl. We can undoubtedly expect further destruction on the scale until we have ended this war. The results of this would be hundreds of thousands of casualties, brutal beyond all measure, but potentially from that, saving Germany from an even more costly world war. The results of this bloody but extremely messy civil war is that by early 1941, maybe even heading into middle of 1941, Nazi forces would likely be completely crushed. With that, we would have the end of World War II, or what should have been World War II, but ultimately did not break out into anything meaningful, lasting really only less than, what, at that point, 9 months? The question then of what comes after, well, this is really up to interpretation here at this point now, isn't it? Instead of a simple white peace with the Allies, the Germans in this sense were able to actually fight with the Allies in order to be able to secure peace. Thus it is that they are unlikely to face certain repercussions in the sense that the Rhineland is not going to be demilitarized again. They're not going to face these kinds of issues, but other things are going to fall more into question, such as the occupation of Poland. In order to secure peace, Poland is likely going to be given up, which is something that is going to infuriate large sections of the German military, but simultaneously they are going to see this as an absolute necessity. Italy, for its efforts, would be given southern territories, as Tyrol would be granted as rightful Italian clay. As for what would happen with the rest of Austria, though, that falls into question. Also Slovakia, also Bohemia, also pretty much anything that the Germans had occupied in the previous years. So, let's go ahead and consider our options here then. First and foremost, Poland would be freed. However, as part of the negotiations and in light of the potential Soviet threat, still, the Danzig territory would likely from this be granted to Germany. Secondly, Czechoslovakia. In the aftermath of the occupation of Bohemia, Slovakia had been set up as a puppet state, but this is not going to happen in this new timeline. The Germans of Sudetenland would likely have been removed into Germany proper, and meanwhile, the actual Czechoslovakian state would once again be restored. The final question, though, is Austria. See, Austria had joined Germany through a referendum, in which, yes, it was very contentious, and simultaneously there was a lot of irregularities that specifically led to the rise of the Nazis. But in an effort to clamp down upon these Nazi efforts, it is likely that Austria itself would be allowed to remain within the German sphere of influence. At least the actual Germanic states. States like Tyrol were granted specifically to Italy in order to entice them into the conflict, in order to be able to enter the war early. Weirdly enough, in this new timeline, only around 500,000 German lives have been lost, and yet simultaneously their territory is greater. Yes, they would no longer have control of the Sudetenland, but they still would control Austria and simultaneously swaths of Poland, though, of course, Poland in this scenario would most certainly not be happy. With half their territory still under control by the Soviet Union and a section of it now under control by Germany, Poland itself would feel betrayed and isolated. But under these circumstances, it wouldn't necessarily be able to do anything else. It would have to work with the Allies, specifically as a defensive goal and deterrent against the Soviet Union. Would an actual invasion of the Soviet Union then happen here? No. No one would actually want that kind of war. With Germany now having aligned itself closer to the Allies, this means that the entirety of Europe would be able to stand against the Soviet menace. which in turn would focus largely on internal developments, just as it had wanted to do in our own timeline, which would allow it to rapidly advance through this time period of its industrial period. As for what would be happening elsewhere, the United States would likely not get involved in the conflict. They would continue during this time period to supply and sell weapons and supplies to the Allies, but they're never likely to go war with Japan. The reason being is that Japan would launch its southern strategy, specifically because of how many rapid gains that the Germans had made. With the fall of Nazi Germany and the end of war in Europe, this means that the Western powers would actually be able to defend themselves against any such incursions. And so the idea of Japan launching its own strike southward in order to be able to invade the Philippines, Dutch Indonesia, and others in order to be able to secure oil and rubber supplies is very unlikely. Instead, Japan would continue to wage a massive death war in China, potentially grinding until eventually they are driven out, or potentially until a negotiated peace would allow them to be able to retain some larger amounts of territories on the coast. But the empire overall would be in a terrible position economically, where it would be ground down over time. What the Soviet Union in turn would do from that here is more than likely focus on aiding communist efforts throughout China in order to be able to drive out the Japanese. With no major invasions or incursions to affect the United Kingdom and France, this means that their colonial empire largely remains intact. The British Raj remains under the control of India, and simultaneously France retains its strong colonial empire. The United States is pulled quite handedly out of the Great Depression through its sales of arms and equipment, but then also simultaneously does not get its own industry supercharged through production that is necessary for the war efforts to actually take the fight to Europe. Instead, the world remains on remarkably more equal ground than it did in our own timeline. But that, my friends, I think is where I'm going to go ahead and end things here today. There isn't nearly as much gameplay that would go into a scenario like this. Obviously, I can present and show and talk about varying things and what would happen here on the map, but it's also different in comparison to what I would normally do because we're talking about a scenario in which an assassination happened. Like that it is such a very specific thing to take place that would ultimately change things like a massive domino effect. So we're going to go ahead and end things here today. But thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Make sure to put your comments in the comment section below suggesting the next alternate history scenario, which we will put into a poll. And also on that note, if you want to learn about other assassination attempts against Hitler, I actually did a podcast episode specifically dedicated to that exact thing, like all the varying different assassination attempts that tried to take him out. My podcast is called the History of Everything podcast, so you should check that out. And I also have a YouTube channel with that same name dedicated to history and geopolitics. Goodbye, my friends, and I'll see you all next time.